There is a car sitting in a garage somewhere in England with 16 miles on the odometer. 16 miles in 30 years of existence. The owners, 3 of them across 3 decades, looked at it, admired it, perhaps ran their fingers along its low, wide flanks, and then closed the garage door and walked away. They couldn't bring themselves to drive it. Not really. Not the way it was meant to be driven. And honestly, you can't entirely blame them. Because the Jaguar XJ220 was not simply a car. It was a promise made in steel and aluminum. A dream built by men who were supposed to be doing something else entirely. A machine that arrived at exactly the wrong moment in history. And somehow, against every conceivable odd, became the fastest production car on the planet. But here is the thing that nobody ever tells you about the XJ220. The people who ordered it, who wrote the checks, who dreamed about it for 4 years, many of them did everything in their power to get their money back before the car ever touched their driveway. They hired lawyers, they went to court, they called it a fraud, a betrayal, a bait and switch of the most expensive kind. And the strangest part of that story? They were right, and they were completely wrong. Both things, simultaneously, in the way that only the most extraordinary failures can manage to be. This is the story of the Jaguar XJ220, the car that was never supposed to exist, that broke the world's speed record, that triggered lawsuits from the wealthy elite, and that is now worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. A story that begins not in a boardroom, not in a design studio, but in a Saturday morning meeting that nobody was officially attending.
To understand how the XJ22 was born, you have to understand what Jaguar was in the mid-1980s. Not what it claimed to be. It always claimed to be something magnificent, but what it actually was. For years, the company had been drowning inside British Leyland, the great nationalised heap of failing British industry, starved of investment, producing cars that were charming in the way that a slightly unreliable friend can be charming. Beautiful, yes. Leaking oil, certainly. The joke in Britain at the time was that you needed to buy 2 Jaguars, because one would always be in the shop. Then came Sir John Egan. He arrived at Jaguar in 1980 with a mandate that can be summarised simply: fix it or watch it die. And Egan, a hard and practical man who understood that image was as important as engineering, went to work. He tightened the production lines, renegotiated with suppliers, rebuilt quality control from the ground up. And crucially, he understood that selling Jaguar meant selling a dream. The Jaguar brand had to mean something aspirational again, not just nostalgic. In his words, delivered to his own board with a certain British understatement, it was about selling the sizzle. The sausage could come later. By 1984, Jaguar had been successfully privatised. Freed from British Leyland, it was now a public company with its own destiny. But freedom brought its own pressure. The company needed a vision, not just improved build quality. It needed a statement car, something that would announce, loudly, unmistakably, that Jaguar was back and meant business. Jim Randall was thinking the same thing, though his ambitions were considerably wilder than the board's.
Randall was Jaguar's head of product development, an engineer's engineer, the kind of man who thinks in tolerances and torque curves, who walks through a design studio and immediately notices what everyone else has missed. He had been at Jaguar long enough to remember what it felt like when the company genuinely led the world, when the D-Type and the E-Type made people stop on streets and stare with their mouths open. He wanted that feeling back. He wanted Jaguar to build something extraordinary. And when the official channels proved too slow, too cautious, too wrapped in spreadsheets and risk assessments, Randall did something that sounds almost comically British in its quiet audacity. He started a secret club. On Saturday mornings, a small group of Jaguar engineers, designers, and trusted suppliers began gathering. Not on company time, not with official sanction, not with budget approval. They called themselves the Saturday Club, and they met to build a dream. The dream was a supercar, a proper one, the kind that would leave Ferrari wondering what had just happened. The name was almost an aspiration in itself, XJ220. The 220 didn't refer to a code or a designation. It referred to the target top speed, 220 miles per hour, which in the mid-1980s was a number that sounded less like an engineering target and more like a piece of science fiction. What the Saturday Club designed was breathtaking. A low-slung, long, wide supercar powered by a 6.2-litre Jaguar V12, the same basic unit that had won races at Le Mans, driving all four wheels through a sophisticated system developed by FF Developments. Scissor doors, active aerodynamics, the whole package. Randall and his team worked weekends, evenings, stolen lunches, building something they believed in passionately, something that had no official existence and no guaranteed future. The car was unveiled at the British International Motor Show in Birmingham in October 1988.
The reaction was not polite applause. It was chaos. Crowds pushed forward to see it. The automotive press ran out of superlatives within the first paragraph. Here, suddenly, was proof that British engineering could still produce something that made the world catch its breath. The show car was enormous, longer and wider than almost any production car that existed. And the design by Keith Helfet had the menacing, low-slung quality of an animal preparing to strike. Jaguar had not announced any intention to build it. It was a concept, a dream made metal. And then, the phone started ringing. The British public and the global wealthy did not want a concept car. They wanted the real thing. Jaguar had not anticipated quite how violent the reaction would be, quite how many people would call wanting to place deposits, wanting to secure their place in line. 1,500 people, in the end, handed over £57,000 each as a deposit, against a purchase price that hadn't yet been set. £57,000, non-refundable. That was, to put it plainly, the kind of faith that few companies ever inspire in their customers. People were essentially writing enormous checks for a car that didn't technically exist, promising to pay whatever it would eventually cost, trusting Jaguar completely. The board met. This was the moment that would define the XJ220 forever after. Building a supercar was not what Jaguar did. It was not what Jaguar was equipped to do, not what the factories were set up for, not what the engineering resources had been budgeted for, and the concept car, beautiful as it was, had been designed without any consideration for production realities. It was too heavy. The V12 engine, running on the emissions regulations that were coming into force in Europe, couldn't produce the power needed to hit anywhere near 220 miles per hour. The all-wheel drive system was enormously complicated. Building this thing at any price would require a partner. Enter Tom Walkinshaw.
Tom Walkinshaw was not the kind of man you invited into a project and then expected to remain a junior partner. Scottish, ambitious, technically brilliant, and possessed of a commercial aggression that sometimes alarmed the more genteel corners of Coventry's automotive establishment. Walkinshaw had already transformed Jaguar's racing program. His company, Tom Walkinshaw Racing, had won the European Touring Car Championship with Jaguar in 1984. In 1988, the same year the XJ220 concept was causing crowds to press against velvet ropes at Birmingham, his XJR9 had won the 24 Hours of Le Mans outright, the first British car to do so in decades. Walkinshaw understood both the engineering and the theatre of performance cars. He was also, at this moment, sitting on something interesting. TWR had acquired the rights to an engine that had been left without a home, the V64V, a twin-turbocharged V6 that had been developed for the MG Metro 6R4 rally car, a Group B monster that was now homeless following the cancellation of Group B rallying. This engine, properly developed, could produce serious power without the emissions problems that plagued the V12. It was lighter, more compact, and in Walkinshaw's hands, capable of things that would surprise people. The deal was made. TWR would develop and build the XJ220. The factory would be at Wickham Mill in Bloxham, near Banbury, opened with a certain theatrical flair by Princess Diana. And the target was ambitious: 350 cars, deliveries beginning in 1992 at a price that would cover the extraordinary development costs. Here is where things began to go wrong. Or rather, here is where the story became what it would be, because the world is always more complicated than the dream. The development process was immense. Every element of the concept had to be re-engineered for reality. The V12 was out. It couldn't meet the regulations and couldn't make the power. The all-wheel drive was out. Too heavy, too complicated, impossibly so for the timeline and budget. The scissor doors were out. The car that arrived at the end of the process was, in its bones, still the XJ220. Still Keith Helfert's design, still enormous and beautiful, still possessed of that unmistakable Jaguar quality of looking simultaneously dangerous and elegant.
But under the skin, it was a different animal. Meanwhile, in the background, something else was happening that would later generate enormous controversy. TWR was simultaneously developing the XJR15, a car that used Jaguar's V12 engine in a racing-derived chassis and bore more resemblance to the original XJ220 concept than the actual XJ220 did. The XJR15 was TWR's own project, using the Le Mans racing technology that the XJ220 had originally promised. When buyers eventually discovered this, that the car they hadn't ordered looked more like what they had ordered, the feeling of betrayal intensified.
The XJ220 was delivered to its first owners in June 1992, and by the time the invoice arrived, something had changed catastrophically in the world outside. The early 1990s recession hit the collectible car market like a hammer. The speculative bubble that had driven Ferraris and other exotic cars to impossible values during the late 1980s, values that had partly fueled the XJ220 deposit frenzy, had burst completely. People who had signed contracts in the optimistic glow of 1989 found themselves in a very different financial landscape 3 years later. And then there was the price. The development costs had spiraled. The production XJ220 cost not the expected amount, but £470,000, nearly £500,000 in 1992. The deposit they'd paid, £57,000, was now the least of their problems. Buyers began trying to cancel their orders, and when they were told the contracts were binding, that their deposits were forfeit, some of them hired lawyers. The litigation was significant. Multiple buyers sued, arguing breach of contract on the grounds that the production car was substantially different from what had been promised. No V12, no all-wheel drive, different specification entirely. In their reading, Jaguar had sold them one car and delivered another. The courts, as they often do, saw it with more nuance. The contracts had been clear enough, and the deposit terms had been explicit, but the reputational damage was done.
Newspapers that had celebrated the XJ220 in 1988 now ran stories about wealthy buyers feeling cheated.
The car that was supposed to announce Jaguar's triumphant return became, in the press narrative, a symbol of broken promises. And here is the point where you have to stop and look at what the car actually was. Because amid all the chaos of the litigation and the market collapse and the PR disaster, someone had built a machine that was, by every objective measurement, extraordinary.
The production XJ220's engine was a 3.5-litre twin-turbo V6 derived from the Walkinshaw V64V, producing 542 brake horsepower in its road specification. Rear-wheel drive only. The body was aluminium, the chassis purpose-built, the aerodynamics functional rather than decorative. The thing weighed under 1,500 kilograms, which by the standards of the era was genuinely light for a car of this size and power. In 1992, a Jaguar XJ220 was taken to the Nardo high-speed track in Italy. With the catalytic converter removed, a standard procedure for top-speed record attempts of the period, the car reached 217 miles per hour. 190 of them spent accelerating, the rest at maximum velocity. It was verified, documented, and official. The Jaguar XJ220 was the fastest production car in the world. Faster than the Ferrari F40, faster than the Lamborghini Diablo, faster than anything that human beings had yet managed to put on public roads. And more than just top speed. A prototype had already set a Nürburgring lap time of 7 minutes and 46 seconds in 1991, faster than any production car that had previously turned a lap of the world's most demanding circuit. The car was not a fraud, not a compromise masquerading as a supercar. It was a genuine weapon. But the name was the problem. XJ220, 220 miles per hour. The car went 217, 3 miles per hour short of the number it wore as its identity. And in the world of marketing, 3 miles per hour is enough to start a lawsuit.
The argument about whether the top speed record counted, the catalytic converter question, the interpretation of production specification became one of the great pedantic battles of 1990s motoring journalism. Some said the 217 was valid. Some said it wasn't. McLaren, arriving with their F1 2 years later, would eventually render the argument moot by reaching 240 miles per hour and removing all ambiguity. Production ran until April 1994. In the end, 281 cars were built, short of the planned 350, with 22 cars that simply couldn't find buyers at list price and eventually left the factory at heavy discounts. A 1998 Top Gear segment reported that unsold examples could be acquired for around £150,000, a significant reduction from the £470,000 launch price. The factory at Bloxham was transferred to Aston Martin, who used it to produce the DB7. The whole operation wound down quietly, without ceremony, like a party that nobody had quite wanted to end, but nobody could find a reason to continue. And then, somewhere in the years that followed, the world began to understand what it had. There is a particular kind of reassessment that happens to misunderstood objects. The XJ220 had been publicly humiliated by the lawsuits, by the market collapse, by the comparison with the McLaren F1 that arrived so soon afterward and did everything better. But as the decades passed and the cars disappeared into collections, and the surviving examples were serviced by the small number of specialists who truly understood them, Don Law Racing primarily, the acknowledged world authority on XJ220 maintenance, the cars began to speak for themselves. Drivers who actually got behind the wheel reported something that the press controversy had almost entirely buried. The XJ220 was sensational. Not just fast, ferocious. The turbo V6 delivered its power in a wave that required both hands and complete attention. The steering was direct, to the point of intimacy, The brakes were extraordinary. It was, by every account of those who drove it properly, one of the great driver's cars of its era. Not perfect, not refined in the way a modern supercar might be, but alive in a way that few machines before or since have achieved.
There was a moment in every misunderstood thing's life when the world catches up to it. For the XJ220, that moment came slowly, the way good reputations tend to arrive, not with a single announcement, but with an accumulation of evidence. The cars that had sold for £150,000 in the late 1990s began climbing, gradually at first, then more steeply, as the realization settled in that 281 cars, 281 examples of the fastest British car ever built, of a machine designed on Saturday mornings by people who simply refused to believe it was impossible, represented not a failed project, but a piece of history. The prices today would cause the original buyers to weep, not from disappointment, but from a different kind of grief. The grief of having been right for the wrong reasons, of having wanted something that turned out to be more valuable than anyone understood at the time. Those who held their nerve, who didn't sue, who didn't sell in the dark years, are now in possession of something that approaches the mythological. The Sultan of Brunei, who famously commissioned multiple custom XJ220s from Pininfarina during the production period, perhaps understood something that the mainstream market didn't. When you are the Sultan of Brunei, you do not buy cars based on Top Gear segments or press conferences. You buy them because of what they are. What they are is this: the last pure product of a very British kind of stubborn romanticism.
The Saturday Club didn't ask permission. Jim Randall didn't have a budget. The engineers who spent their weekends building a dream had no guarantee that the dream would survive its first meeting with a boardroom. They did it because they believed, with the particular irrational conviction of people who genuinely love what they make, that it should exist, that the world would be slightly worse without it. They were right. The car with 16 miles on the odometer is still in a garage somewhere. 3 owners in 30 years, and none of them could quite bring themselves to use it the way it was meant to be used. Perhaps they were waiting. Perhaps they understood in some way they couldn't articulate that there are objects whose value lies partly in being preserved, in existing as a kind of proof that something extraordinary once happened, that ordinary people on Saturday mornings built the fastest car in the world because nobody told them convincingly enough that they couldn't. There is something quietly magnificent about that. In an industry full of calculated risk assessments and focus groups and brand safety committees, the XJ220 remains the ultimate product of simple, obstinate belief. It was controversial and imperfect and legally contested and misunderstood by the very people who ordered it. And it was and remains beautiful in a way that time only improves. The lawsuits are forgotten. The market collapse is a footnote. What remains is the car, low and wide and alive in a way that almost nothing else from its era managed, sitting in the collections of people who understand that some objects are worth more than any argument ever raised against them. The fastest, the most controversial, the most purely believed-in machine that Jaguar ever produced, built by a club of engineers on their days off, driven by almost nobody, loved by everyone. Did you ever own, drive, or dream about a Jaguar XJ220, or any Jaguar at all? Tell us in the comments below.